There are many reasons that we all love Alaska. The coast, the boreal forests, the amazing wildlife, the Arctic, the mountains. I could probably stand here all night and do this, but I won't. Alaska also holds vast mineral wealth, and that mineral wealth is part of the economic base of Alaska. As our featured speaker, Mr. Vic Fischer, witnessed, fishing and mining mismanagement was a driving force during the Constitutional Convention. And in the 1970s, the founders of Trustees for Alaska knew about mobilizing people. But they soon realized that they needed something else. They needed someone to come along and enforce the law to protect Alaska's environment. And so, in 1974, Trustees for Alaska was born. Right away, Trustees became embroiled in issues surrounding the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. Now, this was a project that was moving very quickly. The law had passed just before Trustees was founded, and Trustees helped to fight for mitigation all along the pipeline route. An important early victory for Trustees was when Bill Rice, who is here in the audience with us today, our first attorney and director, filed a lawsuit against an initiative that would have given away 30 million acres of state land to resident Alaskans, a homesteading giveaway. The Alaska Supreme Court agreed with Bill that these appropriations of land, not just money, are prohibited by initiative under the Alaska Constitution. Can you imagine what Alaska would look like today if Bill had lost that case? We would have development everywhere, and all the planning that Vic would have liked to have done probably wouldn't have happened the way it did. So thank you, Bill. On the oil and gas front, Trustees repeatedly challenged the state's best interest findings under the Alaska Land Act. Those best interest findings covered millions of acres of land, but failed to inform the public about the environmental impacts of oil and gas exploration and development. Each time we won, the legislature weakened the law and made it more difficult for the public to ensure protection of natural resources. In 2000, we lost a best interest finding case in Cook Inlet in the Alaska Supreme Court. Even though we lost, it set us up to make new inroads in applying the Article VIII of the Alaska Constitution. To understand those inroads, here's a little background. Article VIII of the Alaska Constitution is the groundbreaking natural resources article. It balances resource development and conservation. It expands the public trust doctrine. The public trust doctrine simply requires the government to protect natural resources for public use. And the first three sections of the Constitution embody that doctrine. Section 1 sets out the policy of having the maximum use consistent with the public interest. So the public interest is very important in these resource decisions. In Section 2, you have the state looking at lands and waters and making decisions for the maximum benefit of the people. So you don't get just to willy-nilly develop wherever you want. You have to actually consider the maximum benefit of the people of Alaska. And Section 3 says that those natural resources, fish, wildlife, the lands, they are all held in reserve to the public, to the people of Alaska for common use. So, who do these natural resources in Alaska belong to?
All of them.
Yes, public. We all own these resources. And so, doesn't that mean we should have a say about how the balance is struck between resource development and conservation? In 2009, we challenged the state's permitting of 2 decades of mining exploration and water use at the Pebble Project in the headwaters of the world's premier salmon runs. The state allowed this without any public notice or analysis, like a best interest finding. And the things that were occurring out there are sump pits with toxic drilling muds that are basically just buried out there for forever. Thousands of drilling holes requiring tens of thousands of helicopter trips. And then direct toxic discharges to the tundra. And withdrawing millions of gallons of water for these drilling operations. Vic joined the lawsuit as a plaintiff because he wanted to help ensure the proper interpretation of Article VIII by the court. The Superior Court didn't agree that notice and a best interest finding is required, but the case is now on appeal to the Alaska Supreme Court. Meanwhile, in 2010, we filed a challenge to the best interest finding in the Beaufort Sea, which is that big yellow area up there. The only analysis the state did for that was at the initial stage of the oil lease. That's a paper transaction. And that does not provide any information to the public about the extractive phases of exploration, of transportation infrastructure, of development, and in the subsistence habitats of the Arctic, these very fragile habitats. In that case, just this last year, we won. The Supreme Court recognized that Article VIII's constitutional protections require an environmental analysis of all phases of oil and gas development, not just the leasing phase. And that decision is likely to influence the decision in the Pebble case. These are just a few of the things that Trustees has done over the last 40 years to defend Alaska's lands, waters, wildlife, and people. Trustees works across the state on diverse issues, and we advocate for clients who are Alaska Natives, conservation groups and community groups, and individuals, free of charge, on cases that they couldn't otherwise afford to bring. Some of you are financial supporters of Trustees for Alaska, and we thank you so much because it has allowed us to do what we do for the last 4 decades. And we'd also like to thank the wonderful photography that is in this, some of which is from a former Trustees attorney, Carl Johnson, who's also in the audience tonight. And those of you who don't know us, please take our materials and check us out on the web, Facebook, and all those other social media things that I don't know that much about. But other people do, which is good. So now, on with the show. Shannyn Moore is just a girl from Homer, but she is also an award-winning radio host, political commentator, and she blogs about the important issues facing Alaska to seek the truth that the public needs to know. Vic Fischer is one of our elder statesmen. After serving in World War II and getting an education in planning, he came to Alaska in the 50s. He fought hard for statehood and served in the territorial legislature. He was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention and had a hand in drafting all parts of the Constitution in his role in the Style and Drafting Committee. He was the first director of what is now called the Institute of Social and Economic Research at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and helped shape development and conservation during his time there. Everywhere he goes, Vic is influential. And tonight he will share a bit of his knowledge with us about Article VIII. So I will invite Vic and Shannyn to come up and discuss Article VIII for us. And after that, we will have an opportunity for people to ask questions from the audience. One thing that I would like to point out that I was told by folks is the books that are out there that are Vic's books, those are for sale. So if you want them, you'll be able to buy them afterwards, and Vic may stick around for a little bit and possibly sign some. But those are for sale out there.
It's like old times, Vic, except there's all these people watching us. Thank you for being here. I've been So lucky to be able to know Vic Fischer. And it was funny, I was talking to someone earlier who I don't consider remarkably clever at the radio station. And he's like, wow, you're not wearing a hoodie today and you're all dressed up. I was like, oh, I have this event at the museum tonight with Vic Fischer. He was like, huh. I said, he wrote the Constitution. He goes, Jesus Christ, how old is that? Lucky for that guy, we had this guy writing the Constitution. Lucky for us, it wasn't that guy writing it, right? Thank you so much for being here, doing this.
It truly is my pleasure, and I'm just delighted to see so many people and a lot of friends and one relative, my wife Jane Einvik is here, and on with the show.
On with the show.
I'm just here to answer questions.
Hope you guys brought some. Vic will answer them, of course. I've been reading a lot of stuff on Article VIII. As you know, we've had some meetings, you and I.
Right.
And we didn't just call Sean Parnell names at our meetings. God, I wanted to quote him in the papers so bad. They wouldn't let me print it. But you said something really remarkable about the Constitutional Convention and how it was open. And that what Bob Bartlett had said was nobody was going to care about anything except for how we dealt with our resources. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Bob Bartlett was our non-voting delegate to the U.S. Congress before we became a state, and he became our first U.S. Senator. Bob was one of the great Alaskans. He was Mr. Statehood. He really worked for it, and he gave the keynote address to the Constitutional Convention on November 8, 1955, when we convened in Fairbanks. And among the statements that Bartlett made was that 50 years hence, you, the delegates, will not be remembered what you did on local government or on the structure of the three branches of the state government or districting. The most important thing is what was done on the issue of resources. And he emphasized that. He went on to warn about the big dangers of outside interest taking advantage of Alaska's resources and not providing adequate benefit to the people of Alaska who will be owning the resources. And secondly, he warned about outside interests that might just lock up Alaska resources for the benefit of resources that they may own or control elsewhere. And he met with the delegates, with the Resources Committee and others after the convention got going, while the deliberations were going on, while we were crafting the Constitution, and he kept emphasizing the importance of resources. And I admit that I was one of those who came thinking about local government and home rule and self-determination at the local level, at the state level, and so on. And it was Bob who really drove home to me personally, as well as to other delegates, the importance of crafting a resource article that would deal with the over 100 million acres of land and subsurface resources that the Congress was about to give us when we became a state.
Right, what did we get, 103?
104.
Well, what's a million acres, right? You know, when we were talking about this, I looked it up, and do you mind if I quote him?
You can quote him, you can quote me, anybody.
Thanks. He said, many states have included in their constitutional statements that the natural resources of the state should be, quote, developed for the benefit of the people of the state. Such pious generalities, without further concrete policy statements, have proved wholly inadequate as effective barriers against the dissipation of resources, fraud, and corruption. Alaskans will not want, and above all, do not need, a resources policy which will prevent orderly development of the great treasures which will be theirs. But they will want and demand effective safeguards against the exploitation of the heritage by persons and corporations whose only aim is to skim the gravy and get out, leaving nothing that is permanent to the new state except perhaps a few scars in the earth which can never be healed. This was the warning, right? And it reminded me of Eisenhower's whole military-industrial complex. I mean, this was like a resource extraction complex that was going to come here. Do you think that without this specific warning of corruption and wanted protection, that Article VIII wouldn't have been written the way it was?
Well, I think that we would have gotten there because every Alaskan, every delegate to the Constitutional Convention knew the history of Alaska, knew about the Russians coming, exploiting the Aleuts and other native peoples for the sake of getting furs, the gold rush, the copper along the Copper River, the outside control of salmon fishery, which was just outrageous prior to our becoming a state, where the resource was raped and for the benefit of outside interest, while local fishermen were standing by and watching fish traps be very efficiently, grabbing the fish and getting them canned and hauled out of state without any benefit to the local people, to the people in the territory of Alaska. So I think the delegates were primed. And right after we convened, within 2 days, Ernest Greening gave a second keynote. He had been Alaska's governor, territorial governor, and Greening gave a wonderful oration about Alaska, the colony, and really driving home the history of Alaska, the extent to which we were a colonial possession of the United States to be taken advantage of by non-Alaska interests.
You bring these people up like they're not buildings.
Well, you know,
Oh, that made me feel young to say. Sorry.
I've had the pleasure of going to Bartlett High School and to Greening and talking to an assembly of students and telling them who this person was, after whom the school was named. And this is one of the benefits of a long life. You got to know them personally, and Bob in particular was became a very close friend.
Yeah, and you outlived them, so you can say whatever you want. Oh, this one time, Bob and I. That's our next story.
Read my book, you.
Yeah, no, it's in there. You want it. So, were there any delegates that you were just like, come on, really, you get to be a delegate?
Well,
you know what I mean? Because there were a lot of you.
In fact, when I got to Fairbanks,
did you have to roommate with people?
Freezing November '55, and I'd seen who was elected as a delegate from different places, but I found out there was one guy, E.B. Collins from Fairbanks, an attorney, and his profile in the Fairbanks News Miner said he was 82 years old. Can you imagine somebody being 82 years old being elected to serve in a constitutional convention? I mean, it just seemed preposterous. I was 31 at the time. And here I am at 90, and if we had a constitutional convention, I certainly could do it, but I didn't believe then that,
82.
that somebody in his 80s could possibly function, and he actually became a chairman of a committee. So if you want to look for somebody way out there, he seemed to be way out there. And then we had wonderful characters, but it would take too much time at this point, unless you want to pursue your culture and people like that.
Oh, I'm familiar. He was just a man from Switzerland, right? He found his way to Homer. So it seems as though in reading Article VIII that this wasn't about conservation. This was about development. I mean, the owner-state whole concept, I mean, you were writing this in order to get more development, correct?
Right.
I mean, that was the drill baby drill of 19...
We wanted, among many other goals of statehood, we wanted to get control of land and resources. We wanted to be able to support ourselves at a time when 99.8% or something like that of land was federally controlled, and everything was controlled by Washington. There was special interest outside Alaska. And I would say that fish conservation was an important issue, but when it came to minerals, it was small-time minerals. It was not massive corporate mining that was viewed, but mining was sort of family style or small operations, and same thing for timber operations and so on. We wanted to have control, we wanted development, and Congress only gave us 100 million acres because they figured we were totally without resources. We were incompetent to take care of our future schools, of running a state government or whatever, and we better give them a dowry of land and subsurface resources so that they can support the future state and services that a state has to give. And the oil development that we've seen, even the scale of mining that we have, which doesn't amount to much in terms of state income, but in the timber cutting and what we've seen, the scale of that was not really conceived. The Constitution was really written with development in mind, but at the same time with rules that would assure that the public interest, and I'm grateful that Vicky and the slides that sort of it was in the public interest, it was maximum benefit to the people, common use doctrine, sustainable yield, keeping the public informed, public notice of whatever the state did. Those were principles that would guide the state in resource development as well as setting land aside for parks and recreation and so on, that also were provided in the constitutional article on resources.
When you say that, you know, the feds looked at Alaska like, oh, they're not going to be able to take care of themselves and all that, you know, if who's in charge now was in charge then, they might have had a point. You know? I mean, can you imagine if Sean Parnell and Sarah Palin were sitting down to write our Constitution with Coghill over there? And, yeah, I'm sorry, I just scared myself. I mean, it's not recognizable.
It's not recognizable, and at the same time, we have a judiciary that still interprets the Constitution to give an occasional victory to the trustees for Alaska, and because they interpret the Constitution the way it was meant to be interpreted, and that is in the context not of 1955 and the thinking of 1955, but in terms of a living Constitution that is applied to today's issues and the principles of the public interest and maximum benefit and public notice are principles of whether certain people in general like it or not, that the courts will enforce.
So this owner state is sort of what we call all of these concepts in Article VIII. Do you think Alaskans even are aware of the concept of owner state, that it's more than a dividend check, it's a responsibility, and that they own this, that you can't...
People come and go, and we've had governors who make these concepts a foundation for what they do as chief executives for Alaska or as legislators, and they live those concepts. Wally Hickel and the owner state, they're synonymous. And Hammond certainly lived the concept of the public interest. And look at Palin also. Palin is the mother of the ACEs, which Parnell and Company just got rid of as of the first of this year. But we did well under the oil tax regime that Sarah Palin and the majority of the legislature gave Alaska back in 2007 or whatever it was. And so they come and go, and we have an election coming up this November, and maybe we'll have a big change.
And we also have one in August. Yeah, speaking of, I mean, that's the whole, the fight right now with, like you said, ACEs being gone, Senate Bill 21 going forward. There's a referendum to do a recall on that. And it's, I mean, this is a fight, this is the second fight for statehood. This is, are we an oil colony or are we a sovereign state? You know, it wasn't that long ago that 10% of our legislature was indicted for taking bribes, like from the oil companies. And people would ask me, how did Sarah Palin get elected? Because she's crazy. And I was like, no, she was anti-oil corruption. I think most Alaskans were, oh, she was pretty. But whatever. So was Andrew Halcrow. So there's that.
Well, you look at history. Frank
Murkowski. Sorry, I didn't mean to bring it back to you.
Frank Murkowski was governor, and Sarah Palin challenged him in the primary, and she beat him in the Republican primary. She beat the Democratic candidate, and in the general election, I mean, she stepped forward on her own, and she had. She was against corruption. She talked about ethics and
open and transparency.
Whatever, and she was. I was going to say on the right side of many issues.
She was.
And He doesn't want to use the word right in a political sense.
Correct. She was on the
But
correct side.
On the correct side, from my standpoint. Then she went on the national stage and went in a direction that many of us may not appreciate, but she came back just a few weeks ago and said, hey, we did pretty well on the ACE's oil tax legislation. When prices were high, we did well, the oil companies did well. When prices were low, when taxes were down, the oil companies sort of were in tandem and sort of, we did well. This SB 21 ain't so good, and that's where we are.
Yeah, absolutely. I know I find it an interesting place and why I love Alaska that I'm in disagreement with Tony Knowles and in total agreement with Sarah Palin on an issue. We can only shoot SB 21 out of a plane.
So,
No.
and the thing is that, we go through these up and downs just like oil prices. Unlike some people who say, okay, well, they project the future and oil prices will be like that, but in fact, oil prices are constantly going up and down, and they're back up again. But the Constitution survives, and it survives the individuals. It'll survive Parnell. It'll survive you and me and all of us. And it was written that way. And Marty Rutherford, who probably many here know, was the Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Natural Resources. She gave a talk yesterday at Commonwealth North on the meaning of some Constitution language. What does maximum benefit mean?
Why is that hard? That seems really simple.
What does best interest finding mean in DNR? She really took these issues apart, and she said it's very hard to define it, to really say exactly what they mean, because it changes in the context and within a framework of the issues that you're addressing and so on. And Marty did a phenomenal job. And the gist of which was that you have these broad principles that you then have to apply to specific cases, because the magnitude of whatever is being proposed, the economics, the social impacts, the environmental impacts of that, there are all sorts of questions that need to be addressed to deal with each individual thing within the Constitution. And fortunately, the Constitution is not so rigid that we have to amend it each 5-10 years to take into account the changing values, the changing conditions of Alaska, of knowledge, and the specifics of each case.
You asked me to talk about more current issues than what happened when you were writing this as much. And I wanted to know...
You can ask me. We
Really?
can talk about anything.
What are you wearing, Vic? No, so I wanted to ask you about HB 77, how it seems that what's happening right now with DNR and this administration is, if they could get rid of the owner state, do you think they would? And do you think that's part of what they're whittling away with some of these policies? Like HB 77, for instance.
Well, for the sake of those who may not know what HB 77
sorry.
was.
Of course they do.
Unfortunately, it's gone. But it was very much alive.
Yes.
Being pushed by the governor and a lot of legislators, and it looked like it was going to go through the legislature until the people rose up and says, wait a minute, this is going too far. And that was legislation that would have given the Commission of Natural Resources virtually individual say over resource exploration, resource development, permitting.
No notice.
Without public notices, without specific project approvals, giving vague authority for massive things that could happen. It was broad authority without limitation, really. And as some hearings took place on the Kenai Peninsula, in Fairbanks, in the Valley, in Anchorage, people just said, this is just crazy. And it wasn't just people who were into issues of conservation and environment. It was sports fishermen and hunters and others who were just don't want to be subsumed by a bulldozing administration that wanted to have essentially virtually unlimited power. And I think that certainly the governor was totally behind HB 77. It was dreamed up within the Department of Natural Resources under a certain candidate for the United States Senate, who has the same name as our Anchorage mayor. And I won't say who. Anyway, there are interests that would do away with the Constitution. And that would have just, well, it would have put the trustees to work real hard.
So that brings up a question of, yeah, certainly it would go to court and they'd be testing the constitutionality of it. And the state is fine. Our legislators, correct me if I'm wrong, but if they pass a law that's not constitutional, trustees or someone else sues them for it, the state has the Attorney General's office defending them, right? So they have nothing to lose to pass that sort of law. But how has SB 21 not been taken to court under the Constitution, under Article VIII, for maximum benefit laws?
If I were on the SB 21 side, I would say, of course it's constitutional. It meets the maximum benefit to the people because the oil industry is projecting increased production in the future. The governor said we'll have an daily oil throughput of production of 1 million barrels.
You have to say it like this, 1 million barrels. I really wish you would have just done that. It would have been more honest.
Essentially doubling the production today. And this will be of maximum benefit within 5 years, 10 years, 20 years for our children and grandchildren. It's going to be, because the industry will invest more money in more production and Alaskans will live happily ever after. And the Attorney General's office would happily take on that case and take it to the Supreme Court and argue all along that SB 21 meets the maximum benefit criteria.
With a straight face.
With a straight face. And as Marty described yesterday, it's very hard to argue these issues unless you go through a real best interest finding. And of course, nobody really went through best interest finding in SB 21. It was proposed by the governor and passed by legislators without ever really going into the impacts, what it really means to the future of Alaska. Nobody ever does that in legislation.
Doesn't that seem like kind of a conservative, prudent idea? I mean, that like a smart thing, not a conservative politically thing?
No, because...
That you actually find out if it's a good law or not?
Oh, no. You come into Juneau and you know what you want. And if you don't know, the lobbyists are going to tell you. And then you go into a caucus in the side room in the Capitol, and the leadership is going to tell you exactly how you're going to vote. And that's all there's to it.
Was that what you had in mind?
Did I have it in mind?
Yeah.
No, we didn't do that in my day.
Really? You and Clem Tillian just duked it out?
I fortunately never dealt with. He's a lot bigger than I am. No, in the Constitutional Convention, we didn't have caucuses that had special interest. There were 55 people who had a common goal of writing the best possible Constitution, who studied, who might have different ideas, but they all got together, they worked together. Compromise was not a dirty word. We worked everything out. Bill Egan was a phenomenal presiding officer who made sure that every one of you had a chance to participate on every issue and every article and every section and every sentence and wording and concepts and anything and everything. Everything got worked out we took votes, and some of us were on the winning side and some of us were on the losing side of specific issues. And, some want the voting age to be 18, others want the voting age to be 21. The compromise was 19, which did, had no particular reason, but it wasn't 18 and it wasn't 21, so the compromise was worked out. And eventually, of course, nationally we went to 18, but we agreed on that and went on to the next issue. But the legislatures function pretty much like that.
So, is there anything that you wish would have gotten into Article VIII? Is there anything that you think would have just pushed it a little bit more in the direction you wanted to see it?
No. I think it's essentially there. I think if we were writing it today, we would, oh God, no, you don't want to write that today. Because we would be thinking about oil and gas and pipelines, and there would be so many extraneous issues. I was going to say, we would have a greater balance between the development orientation that delegates had at the time, the underlying direction. It would be more balanced with environmental concerns and quality of air and water and so on. But I wouldn't want to change anything at this point, because opening up the resource article opening up a judiciary article could just make the whole state structure, not as a fiscal structure, but the state come crashing down with special interests, just getting their specific
So
interest.
the calls for a constitutional convention now that we're hearing, you wouldn't want to see that?
Well, we just voted on it 2 years ago, and
Well, they're
it
bringing
was
it up again.
overwhelmingly turned down.
Well, the legislature's still, looking at that.
Well, they tried to undermine it. They tried to undermine the structure of the judicial council to give more political control to the governor and to the legislature over the appointment of judges. But I should say the selection of judges. But fortunately, that kind of a constitutional amendment was stopped. And I think the people are smarter than the politicians in Juneau give them credit for.
Well, they do have the
He
proof
says-
of the polls.
He says hopefully.
I mean, there is the proof in the polls. The fact that that's who we have in Juneau sometimes proves it, but for some reason people don't feel the responsibility to vote. I sort of have this theory that to get a permanent fund, you should have to show your, seal it with your I voted sticker that they give you. And by the way, if you're allergic to latex, don't put them on you. They'll give you the hives.
Well, my response to that is, who knows how they will vote?
Well,
The ones who don't vote now.
yeah, it'd be hard to do worse than we are. Are you hopeful for this next election?
I'm very hopeful that our referendum will be approved and the oil tax regime will be changed, and those of us who are working on a repeal of the giveaway aren't necessarily wedded to ACEs as it was a year or 3 years ago. We think that there are aspects of ACEs that should be changed, can be changed, and what we really need is a legislature and a governor who will see to it that we have oil tax legislation where truly the benefits from development, from production of oil, it's our oil, it's our resources, that the full benefits from that will come to the people of the state as required in Section 2 of Article VIII, and at the same time be fair to industry. I mean, I'm one who believes that Alaska has benefited tremendously from production of oil, and we're sitting in a building that Elmer Rasmussen helped fund, but oil has been a big factor in the quality of life that we've had, and none of us involved in the vote yes referendum are anti-oil per se, or even anti-industry. We think we need more exploration. More exploration means more independent oil companies getting involved in Alaska. SB 21 is not conducive to more exploration for new fields, for truly new oil. And so...
But You know, I got to go to a $40 million high school for 400 kids because of oil. I mean, you can't throw a rock and not hit something with a sign on it that says something about them, right? I get that part. But I'm not grateful to them for coming here and producing oil that they make a profit off of. I'm grateful to you and the founders of this state who wrote Article VIII the way you did. I mean, and to oil companies, I say, you're welcome. Nobody's shooting at you here except for those two brothers that got in a fight and shot the pipeline. But other than them, I mean, they don't have to have security. People are being kidnapped. It feels like it in winter. I get it. But, you know, you're welcome, oil companies. You got to come here. You got to produce our oil, and you got to make a giant profit. Now, stop acting like we're the ugly girl on a date and we got to, like, buy your dinner, too. You know?
Shannyn, I agree with you. The oil companies are here because they want to, their job is to make money for the shareholders and the managers and
Yeah, they're not going anywhere.
Right, they're not going anywhere. And if they went and smaller companies came, it would be a disaster. I took off along the line. You asked me a question, am I hopeful? Yes, I'm hopeful that people will approve, vote yes in the referendum. It's the David versus Goliath kind of a thing where they've got $10 million already put into media, and we're still way ahead in the polls, and the more money they put in, the stronger I think we will be when people go to the polls and vote. So I'm hopeful, and after we win, then it'll be a matter of getting, in order to get where we want to get, it'll be a matter of electing a governor, electing legislators who will put together the proper kind of a package that will benefit Alaskans.
Well, I have a million more questions, but I'm sure lots of other people have questions as well. And wasn't that our agreement? They could ask us anything they wanted? No. Are you ready for questions?
Ready? You are.
There's a question. Yeah. Vicky, do you want to go?
Was there any discussion in the Constitutional Convention about where the capital should be, and where do you personally feel on that issue today?
There was a discussion at the Constitutional Convention about the capital move. The Southeast delegation was solid. It's got to stay in Juneau. There were people who felt very strongly that Juneau was too far out of the way, that it ought to come into the rail belt, Anchorage or Fairbanks. This was a case of true compromise or setting the issue aside, and the decision was made to let the future determine where the capital will be rather than the Constitution. So there was a provision put into the transitional measures, or maybe in the general article, that the capital, I think it was a transitional, capital shall be in Juneau. But that was essentially subject to the legislature or the people by initiative changing that. It was not frozen in the Constitution. In my stand, I've never felt strongly one way or the other. So far as I'm concerned, Juneau is just fine. But if it's to move, it shouldn't be in Willow or someplace like that. It should be as close as possible to the Anchorage International Airport and really be accessible to people in Alaska.
Maybe we could put it at the Bill Sheffield Hotel out there, whatever that mausoleum is. That'd be used.
Shannyn and Vic. In the 1970s, during my relative youth,
Before I was born.
yes, that's true. I got swept up in the first Hammond campaign, thanks to folks like Bob Whedon and Chuck Koningsberg and Walt Parker. And there was a great moment, I think, from that campaign and what happened afterwards that we can learn from with regard to self-determination for Alaska. And that is the Kachemak Bay lease buyback. I think that was the point at which we really asserted Alaska's rights. Could you reflect on that a little bit?
My reflection is simply, I fully agree, it was a great time. And we were all very hopeful, and we had a Republican governor who ran a very democratic, with a small d, state. There were wonderful things going on. Jane ran the Alaska Public Forum, where the governor said, go out and talk to the people and see how they feel about offshore oil drilling, how they feel about permanent fund and setting up a permanent fund and so on. There was communication, there was open government. It was a great era. Kachemak Bay just being one of many good things that were going on. And some awfully stupid things happened too. We won't go into that.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank you. I always feel honored to be in your presence. So, when the Constitution was written, almost contemporaneous, the Hawaiian Constitution was written. Its natural resources provisions actually recognize the customary and traditional uses by Hawaiian natives for their resources. And when the Constitution was written, almost 25% of the population was Alaska Native. 1 delegate out of 55. Was there any awareness of this lack of representation of Alaska Native people? There's only one discussion that had anything to do with their rights for living a way of life in the entire convention, and that was brushed aside. And so, I represent folks like that. It's very difficult the way Article VIII is written, because it was very development oriented. It is very equal rights, common use, etc. And as that's looked at broadly by the courts and people, that whole notion of equality does not really sit well with trying to protect them like it's already here. So I'm just wondering if there was any reflection at the time that there was a quarter of Alaska that wasn't represented.
This is an issue that I've been very much involved in over the recent years, during the years of 50 years of the Constitution, 50 years of statehood, and I worked with First Alaskans Institute, and they actually learned a lot. Jeannie Least and I traveled all over the state discussing that very issue of statehood and Alaska Natives, what it meant, why there was only one delegate in the Constitutional Convention who was Native. And I'll try to be as brief as I can. I can explain why there was only one. If I were, I won't play God, but if I were king, I might have allocated seats to natives, to urban, to whatever. But it wasn't like that. Excuse me. Oh, I have a mute button here, excuse me.
I would have just answered it was 1955. I mean, it's sad. And looking back at that, I will say that Alaska gave voting rights to Native Alaskans before America gave them to Native Americans. And women also had the right to vote here 20 years before women did from America. You know, it doesn't make it all okay, but there were advancements. And I think part of that had to do with if you fell out of a boat, you didn't care who picked you up out of the water, right?
Okay, go back to 1955. There were no Native regional organizations outside of Southeast. Most Alaska Natives lived in pretty isolated communities, isolated within areas from each other, and certainly isolated region to region, but not organized. Taino chiefs met occasionally, but they did not have an organization. So there was number one, no organization. Secondly, most of the communities, Native communities, still led a subsistence life, mostly a subsistence lifestyle. They had adequate fish, generally had adequate game. They could subsist. There was no specific issue that would unite them at that stage. They generally voted in territorial elections. However, the Constitutional Convention was not a political event. It was a nonpartisan election. There were no parties that made sure that Quethluck came out and voted for Democrats or Republicans or whatever. It was nonpartisan. I think more than anything else, it was writing the Constitution that was sort of sounded like esoteric exercise about the future, had very little to do with what was going on in the community, in the region, in people's actual lives. And so there were relatively few, and I don't remember the exact numbers, of Alaska Natives, and I have written on that, who ran to be a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. I think there were 4 in Southeast, and Frank Provocatovich, who was already in the Territorial Senate, was well known. He had been elected at large in Southeast, so he was elected. Andrew Holt from Sitka had been in the Territorial House. He ran, he almost made it to delegate. He didn't quite make it. 2 others weren't close. As I remember, the only other native candidates were in the Nome Juneau Creek area, and one almost made it, but it just wasn't. It turned out that native voters there was not interest. I was asked earlier about what I would change in the resource article, and I said I wouldn't change anything, but I would certainly change the preamble that now says grateful to God and those who pioneered this great land. You saw the miner with the dog and pickaxe and so on. No reflection of the cultures of Alaska that existed for thousands of years. It's certainly the preamble. And the other is recognition of tribes as elements of the state's local government structure. But that's not too relevant to your question. Sorry, long answer, but I wish it had been different.
Hi. I just wondered what you thought of the notion of an owner's state and the Ninth Circuit Court decision about navigable waters, which the Supreme Court refused to take, this Supreme Court refused to take. And what it means is the state doesn't have jurisdiction over navigable waters anymore.
Tony, let me just say the concept of the owner state, I think we are the owner state, and we need to act like the owner state, because we do own 30% of the land and probably more than 30% of the valuable resources of Alaska. We are the owner state of what we own. I think while we're the owner state and have a hell of a lot to say, and can have a lot to say over what we do and where we go, we need to also recognize that 60% of Alaska is owned by the people of the United States, and that they have an interest, and I don't have much use for those who jump up and down and say the federal government is standing in the way of development, and if they would just give us their land, we could be more successful. I don't know about the Ninth Circuit Court. I have no particular view on that.
Good evening, Vic. Happy birthday. I'd like to buy a couple lengthy questions. Would you have a happier birthday if everybody bought a couple books?
If what?
If everybody bought a couple books.
Oh, they feel free not to buy my book.
The questions are about the superior and the superior beneficial use and how beneficial preferences among beneficial uses are to be assigned. We have a statute establishing subsistence as a superior beneficial use, and an example being Cut Mine, where you have subsistence in commercial, a renewable commercial fishing industry. How is the state supposed to determine preferences among those types of uses? And related to that, with maximum beneficial use, what kind of timeline horizon was contemplated, given the renewable and perpetuity of a fishery versus a limited resource extraction resource that would necessarily have a pollution effect in perpetuity.
I think you have a very good question, and I'm going to dodge it. Because in writing the Constitution, when laid out certain principles and left them for future implementation, throughout the Constitution, but specifically on the items that you mentioned, the concepts are there. But they have to be resolved really in the context of what it is you're considering. If you're considering mining coal in the bed of the Chuitna River, I think you come up with one set of analyses and one set of answers as against a totally different kind of a situation where there are marginal issues to be considered, where there might be various concurrent uses that have to be taken into account, where subsistence is key, and so, again, the Constitution is meant to be a living Constitution and applied. And I wish Marty Rutherford were here and you could hear her 20-minute presentation on how to, she was talking about arriving at how you approach the issues of maximum benefit and some of the others that you mentioned in the context of considering the gas pipeline and LNG pipeline. And she lays out how you approach a best interest finding in the context of a specific project, and it would vary tremendously for the different project. So I'm doubting you.
Pretty hard to have a concurrent use when you remove 14 miles of the Chuitna River and tell people you'll bring it back in 50 years. Because the salmon are just going to hang out, spawn offshore for 5 decades, and then when you give them the river back, yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation this evening. My name is Helen, and 2 questions. One, you talked about the context of the living constitution, and we talked about Article VIII, obviously. I was wondering if there are any synergies between Article VIII and other provisions of the Constitution that you feel like should be explored. So oftentimes, this is the High Court will look at declarations of policy in other areas of the Constitution in order to help it have a holistic understanding of what was intended by the terms of Article VIII itself. And then I also wanted to ask, in a completely different vein, as a new Alaskan, I'm curious to ask you about how you would characterize your relationship to your Alaska citizenship. Would you say, I can only imagine the service that you provide to the state. You must feel very passionately about being a member of the state. And I wonder if you think of it as like a sibling kind of love, or a parent kind of love, or a romantic kind of love.
Yeah, how do you snuggle Alaska at night? Nothing wrong with spooning your favorite steak. I'm not judging anybody.
Well, I'm a very happy Alaskan.
moment.
Define for me.
She wanted to know how you feel, what is your relationship to Alaska? Do you love it as a parent or a child or a sibling or a lover or what?
I will say, I don't love it as a parent. I don't feel as a I'm in charge or that okay, let me approach it another way. I'm sitting here because I've outlived every other constitutional convention. I was flying to Juneau on an Alaska Airlines plane that was almost empty. It's hard to imagine these days flying on an empty plane. It was a Constellation, a large plane. And I was sitting back a ways, and toward the front was Bob Reeve, who famous Alaska pilot, owner of Reeve Aleutian Airways. And I noticed Bob Reeve going from one side of the plane, looking out the window, and then going to the other side of the plane, then looking out a window, and then going back and forth. And we were flying through the St. Elias range, and I went up and sat next to Bob as we got past the mountains, and we were talking about. Bob said, "I have flown this route hundreds of times, and every time I'm over these mountains, he didn't say I connect with them, but he said, I'm just overwhelmed." And this is how I feel about Alaska. I am sort of overwhelmed by the nature, by the scope, by the variety, by the people of Alaska, and as I started, I don't love it as a child. I feel very much part of it. I'm very grateful that fate brought me here when I was very young, and I was 26. I made my own way here. But I fell in love with it within a week, and figured I'd be here the rest of my life. And it's given me a lot. It's given me the ability to be myself and connect, to be an activist, to participate in forums, to love people, quite a few present, and it's just great. And I don't even remember what your first question was.
That's great.
That's actually a great note to end on. So thank you all very much for coming, and thank you to our guest interviewer and Vic Fischer and Shannyn Moore, and
Vicki,
thanks again. Yeah.
I warned you.
Oh yes, okay.
Trustees for Alaska is a fabulous organization, and I'm glad they brought all of us together. But I would be remiss in my duty to Alaska if I didn't ask you to pick up an envelope at the table where the books are and make a financial contribution to the vote yes on one repeal the giveaway campaign. The envelopes, if you can't or don't want to give the contribution, but if you could volunteer, there's provision for volunteering. We need all the help we can get. We've got massive world-class corporations that are trying to invade our Constitution, and we need all the help we can get to deal with Goliath, and please help us. Thank you, Vicki, for letting me intrude on the trustees. You're doing great work, and we hope you'll all vote yes on one.